Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten. Today we have with us a special guest. It is Professor Scott Yenor. He is a professor of political science at Boise State University. Welcome, Scott.
Well, thank you for having me on, Pastor. I appreciate it.
You are welcome. You're more than welcome to call me Pastor. I'm not your pastor, but so you can call me Jason if you want.
No, I'm too old-fashioned to do that.
Well, I appreciate that. The reason I had you on today is I had read an article that you had written for First Things entitled, loved the title, An Anatomy of a Cancellation. And towards the end of that article, you suggest that pastors and churches begin to cultivate a spirit of martyrdom. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. What you see as the how one might begin to do that. It's not something that Christians, I think, at least in the United States, are used to hearing. And if we are, we're used to hearing it about other places and only in terms of those who are dying for the faith, not necessarily as our Lord puts forth in Matthew 5, receiving all kinds of evil things said about us or just done to us in general. So when we think of martyrdom, we don't think of lesser degrees. We just only think of death. What were the events that precipitated your kind of conclusion in terms of cultivating a spirit of martyrdom in our age? What happened?
Yeah, I gave a talk at the National Conservatism Conference in what is now, I think, October of 2021. It was a speech against feminism and, calling for an anti-feminist family policy and culture. I think sub rosa, it was also a call for the reconstitution of a Christian family. A fruitful family, a soft patriarchal family, where men are honored and responsible instead of just demands being made for men being responsible. And of course, they serve their wives as part of a larger, purpose in life. And, but, I had some very critical remarks about the influence of feminism and also the, calls for the discontinuation of certain policies that we have today. When word got back here at Boise State about my speech through social media, there was kind of a canceling swarm began to form. Boise State itself took part in that canceling form, began Title IX anti-discrimination charges against me. And so I had to, fight back the idea that I discriminate against women in my classrooms and such. And so I felt all of the aspects of a cancellation, the intense, social media pressure, I suppose. I mean, I didn't feel this too much because I don't look at my social media, but the attacks on my, lots of phone calls, tons of emails, attacks on my financial and social media, links on the internet. People went after my wife and family, and then the charges came at Boise State. So I tried to describe in the article all the aspects of this cancel culture, and at the end of it, I tried to talk a little bit about what cancel culture means. The first conclusion I had in the article is that every culture is a cancel culture. There is something that every people holds sacred and that can't be laughed at. Plato said that we live in a cave, And that means that man is governed by opinions, and certain opinions are simply off base and can't be entertained or can't be publicly uttered. And the real problem with our cancel culture is the content of it. It's a very inhuman content to the cancel culture, and I think it's something that the church gets put under extraordinary pressure to conform to the world because of that
Mm.
cancel culture. Many
Yeah.
pastors, both Catholic and Protestant, um, are are put under extreme pressure for speaking the truth about same-sex marriage, or for earlier in our time, speaking about abortion.
Mhm.
And so the tendency will be to avoid those topics. And, I think the only way to really reconstitute any kind of decent Christian culture is to invert our current cancel culture and have a different set of principles that will get you, shut out of polite company.
Mm.
And if we're going to build any kind of a decent Christian culture that has opinions that support Christian families and the faith, we're going to have to be able to stare in the face of the cancel culture. We're going to have
Yeah.
to still be able to speak the truth to it. And in order to do that, I mean, I just said that at the end of it, that cancellation, as we practice it today, I mean, it's not martyrdom. I wasn't stoned.
Yeah.
Some like nasty emails and bad phone calls, and attacks simply on my financial accounts, and just a discrimination charge against where I live. I mean, it wasn't St. Stephen being stoned or anything like that. But if you're going to build a decent culture, you have to be able to kind of speak the truth, and that's going to lead to uncomfortable social situations. And if the church doesn't simply embrace that,
Yeah.
it will end up, I think, caving to our current culture. And so I said, I think the cancellation is not martyrdom, but it's in the odor of it.
Yeah.
And so I think that this is going to end up being a kind of big issue as the church enters what my friend Renn calls the negative world, that is a world where Christianity is considered a negative by the American regime and by many of the American people.
Yeah. So to be clear, you were not saying um, that you were going through martyrdom, but rather calling really Christians in general to begin to, um, as the early church and the early Christians saw, they saw it as a net good and benefit to suffer for the name of Christ, whatever that suffering might be. Whereas in our day, perhaps we see suffering as something to be avoided altogether. Am I following you there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of movements in, say, evangelical Christianity that center around the idea of cultural engagement. And
Mm-hmm.
cultural engagement means, generally, in practice, we're not going to emphasize the parts of Christianity that make people uncomfortable. We're going to emphasize the parts that make them comfortable. And then we're going to, after we winsomely and nicely make friends, we're going to, like maybe gently suggest, perhaps it might seem, some of these other things that make people uncomfortable. And in other words, niceness comes at the expense of doctrine.
Yeah.
And I think that's I think that's a well-known fact at this point.
Yeah.
Almost every change, doctrinal change in the area of sexuality and family, has seen American Protestant churches drift more toward the culture, never away from it. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're not willing to not drift with the culture, you're, I should say, if you're not going to drift with the culture, you're going to like run up against it. And that means
Mm-hmm.
that you're going to be in the spirit, in the odor of martyrdom. That is, you're going to be bringing great personal cost to yourself at this point.
Yeah. So it kind of sounds like contending for the church to assume the position of authority instead of just begging to be invited to the table.
Yes, I mean, I like that way of putting it, right? I mean,
Uh,
there's a
uh,
price to be paid for Christian witness, and that Christian witness is done on the basis of confidence
yeah.
uh, and not from a position of
Mhm.
doubt. Even though there might not be a lot of cultural support for the Christian witness,
Yeah.
um, it's nevertheless the calling of all of us. So,
Yeah.
like when you write something like this, you're not trying to, I was really trying not to aggrandize myself or see myself as the center of the conflict of Western civilization. But, and I felt very constrained in writing what I was writing, but not to sound like that.
Yeah.
Uh, it's just that these kind of episodes are something that we've witnessed tons of times over the last 10 years, and we're going to increasingly witness them, I think.
Mhm.
Unless people, adopt the position of niceness and cultural engagement, which I think ultimately ends up sacrificing Orthodox Christian teachings on the altar of America's current culture.
Mhm.
And, the gospel is a sword, the law is a sword. They're going to divide people, they're going to be controversial. And unless they're confidently, spoken and believed by Christians, I think that the church is going to suffer mightily.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and even in the early centuries of the church, the whole point was compliance. I mean, they just wanted you to comply. Um, this is Polycarp and Perpetua. And of course, uh, they had, they endured suffering and death, but they didn't care about our doctrinal positions. They just said comply. So whatever
Yeah,
that compliance would be, which would be to get, essentially give up um, our core belief, period, that the scriptures actually delineate and show forth our way of life in this world, and that's what we are must comply to, give that up in order to comply. And obviously, for an actual Christian, that's a no go.
yeah. And in the area in which this stuff is really hitting the church all over is, the issues of sex, sexuality, gender, family.
Hmm.
And I mean, it's really hitting the church. And so I happen to just do all my writing in that lane.
Yeah.
So uh, so kind of by accident, but also not by accident, I suppose.
So,
I
are there
crosshairs on this stuff.
is there a sense in which what we are facing now has kind of been a slow boil of the frog, that we've already given up positions that we should not have given up in the past 25, 50 years or so? Are there things that we will have to go back even farther to say, look, we swallowed the cultural pill back then and we never should have? Are there
Yeah,
things that have contributed to our unease right now because we've just been out of practice standing firm and pushing back?
yeah. Our regime is not Joseph Stalin, who imposed immediately 5-year plans and collectivized the rural areas in Russia and, led to the death of millions. Ours is kind of 1,000 nudges,
Mm,
all in the same direction, 1,000 paper cuts.
mm,
And one of the things that I do in my research is talk about this particular issue. I call it the rolling revolution
okay.
in what I write. That there's a revolution. You can never like totally identify what the most important point in that revolution is. It's just that it has a logic to it.
Okay.
There's two expressions of that revolution. One is modern feminism, and the other is the sexual revolution or sexual liberation. And like there's counter arguments, decent counter arguments been made at all the points here, like, oh, maybe we should deregulate obscenity or pornography, or, maybe we should not have laws against sodomy, or maybe we should not have laws against fornication, or maybe we should, like you can, every time there's a reasonable argument, to be made on each side. But when you add up the accumulating effects of each of these changes, what you're realizing are principles that are entirely hostile to the faith and entirely hostile to civilization. And so what do you do when you have 1,000 paper cuts? I mean, which paper cut is it? Well, it's the guy with the paper that's cutting you. And in our particular case, it's the ideology that is kind of driving and informing all of these small reforms. Because these small reforms, I call them in my book retail reforms, are really part of a larger revolution. Like the real reforms are, ending patriarchal socialization and achieving female independence from the family, and ending all sexual taboos. Boom. Like that's what it's about. But at each point, it seems like it's about something smaller. So, it's easy to see how people were initially like drawn into the whole movement. But when you peel back the onion, you have to actually, I think, attack the root cause, which is these ideologies that are animating all of the specific reforms. And it's hard to know. It's hard to know which particular thing is the straw that breaks the back of the camel. When in the 70s, for instance, when the gay rights movement began, who would have thought that would lead to, I don't know, like gay pornography for kindergartners? Well, some people who looked like wackos in the 1970s said that that's where it would lead. They look like they're vindicated 50 years later. And is that, what's the line? And so, it's a total issue. It's very difficult to know. And to me, the attitude of the church needs to be, how do we gut the church of the assumptions of feminism and sexual liberation theory?
Yeah.
As the culture moves in that direction, we should be pushing toward the other direction, kind of knowing that we should err against the world and toward the church.
Yeah. So where, just in your opinion, from where you sit in the pew, what are the, because, where I stand in the pulpit, I'm always thinking I've got everyone from someone who's fully on board like you to someone who's never heard this before. And so what are and you're trying to, you're trying to inform, without, completely busting the faith of someone. You're trying to bring them along in some cases, and have their eyes opened to these realities that perhaps they've never really thought about before, or now they're thinking like something's off, but they're not thinking, oh, the problem is, their beloved, government school, or their, I don't know, I mean, any of the sports teams, or, their television, or the things that they're reading and listening to. They see that something's wrong, but they don't know where it's coming from. Like you're saying, it's all these cuts, and they don't know where to point to. What are your suggestions as someone who also speaks in the front of a class, or to people who are in different spots in their understanding? What are your suggestions to, your average run-of-the-mill pastor who's trying to help their people make sense of all these things and bring them along within the biblical understanding and of the world and how we should view it?
Well, that's a big question, and it would be very presumptuous of me to answer it. Nevertheless, I will. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. I will maybe just offer a few things. I mean, it seems to me that I'm just a little over 50 years old, and I've never lived in a world that was not, I would say, saturated with feminist and sexual liberation principles.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that the most important and politically astute thing that a pastor could do is spend time describing what a Christian world would be without those principles. That is, without necessarily spending tons of time confronting those who are in their lives, because we all are in our lives, saturated in this particular culture, spend time describing what that alternative culture is. So what should the family look like without feminism? What should, generally relations between men and women look like without both feminism and sexual liberation? Like, spend time explicating, showing the Christian alternative to the way we currently live. And this, I think, is the best way of not being defensive, being perhaps less offensive, but also doing a manifest service to the congregants who have never seen a world without this stuff. And just like, it's a little bit like traveling. When I travel with my kids, I tell them about the world before the TSA. And they are like, oh, you could just walk up to the gate? Oh, there was like just a metal detector. Anyone could walk up there? How strange. And I'm like, yeah, it was great. I really resent the fact that they've built the TSA. And whereas they've never known the world, they've never known an airport without the TSA. In a similar way, I think that the world, the Christian world, that was non-feminist and non-sexual liberationist before whatever date you want to pick, 1970 is the one I'm picking, is needs to be described. And there's obviously biblical stories that describe it. And I think eventually you can draw great contrast between what is being done now and the world before. And some of those implicate Christians in sin.
Yeah.
They will never know about unless this world is drawn, and the contrast between the world and that as it exists now and the world that it should be is drawn. And so it seems to me like you're obviously suffering from great political problems when you're a pastor that I very much sympathize with. You want to speak against divorce, and you have parishioners who are divorced. The same thing happens when I teach. I speak about divorce, and I no doubt know that there are many people who are in my class who are divorced or products of divorced homes. Same thing goes with single mothers. It's bad for society, and you had that experience. And so it's a very big political problem that I think can be massaged or taken head on by spending time describing what the proper relations are and why they reflect the love of God and his plan for human salvation and decent human life.
Yeah. So in other words, it kind of sounds like what you're saying is that kind of what G.K. Chesterton does in the What's Wrong with the World essay, where he says, we all kind of know what's wrong with the world. The problem is we don't know what is right. We don't know actually what the ideal is. And because we never describe that, we can never actually get to the point where we can actually solve problems. The thing is, Christians actually know what the ideal is. We know, and we're not describing that.
That's what I suggest. Yeah, I mean, when you compare me with G.K. Chesterton, I take that as a compliment.
Okay.
I wasn't thinking about that, but I'm happy to say that Chesterton follows my ideas.
Well, that's great. Yeah, good. I'm glad to have given you that compliment. But that makes total sense. If all we know is what's broken, and we never take the time to at least describe what the biblical picture of this beauty in the home or in society is, then we shouldn't expect anything but what we continually have.
Yeah, like I just tell my kids, I want to abolish the TSA and I want to get back the way it was. And they just look at me like I'm crazy. Like, what do you mean a world without the TSA? Well,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
would a world without, I mean, like the mass public acceptance of divorce look like? What
Hmm.
would a world where of, you know, blocks and blocks of intact families led by fathers who are, honored for their fatherhood and are responsible for the people under their care?
Hmm.
And what would that look like? And like, it's not it's something that many of us have never seen. It's just like
Hmm.
the world without rock and roll music or something. Like you can't even imagine what the world was like. Man, the music's pretty darn good before rock and roll.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think that loss of memory um, is some the memory has to be recovered,
Hmm.
and I to me that would be the most important part of any strategy.
Okay. You said a couple things. What other strategy would you suggest?
Well, I mean, I think everything else needs to be done on a more personal level,
Okay.
um, or in groups where it can be you can tread lightly and gauge people's reactions.
Hmm.
So, I think that this would be a very good, like Bible study kind of uh, topic for marriage prep classes. I think this would
Hmm.
be another place where I would, and I'm sure this is done in many churches, um, where you might integrate this stuff. I mean, I would like to move toward a world where there are no marriage prep classes, where marriage prep is the culture around you,
Yeah.
and you have enough examples of good marriages, and there's kind of expectations for what men and women should do, and there's lines between right and wrong that everyone kind of understands. And so that why would you need a marriage prep class? It's kind of ridiculous.
Hmm.
Um, and but to get to that point, you probably have to have marriage prep classes. My
Yeah.
marriage prep class was like 2 hours of do you guys get along? And we walked out of this. It was 1992 or something. I'm like, wow, that was really lame. And I now look back on it and saying, wow, that's great. It was so lame. It's
Yeah.
like we knew what we were doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm a rural Wisconsin boy, so
Yeah. In terms of prepping congregation members to, um, I guess, to exercise their muscles of resistance against just kind of the the cultural attacks against our faith. Maybe not inoculation, but in what you see on a daily basis, besides giving that picture, what other things um, have are now falling to the church to make up for because it's not happening at home or um, in primary school or things like that? Are there other things that you see that, you know, early on in Christianity, it grows because, um, I mean, besides the fact that the Holy Spirit is working by the gospel, but they actually, they took care of the sick and they took the widows and the orphans in. They they lived as Christ would have them live. Um, what things are falling by the wayside in society that the church should actually be looking to, um, I guess, enter into that field? Things that you see on a daily basis that perhaps, a guy like me, um, I live, I live more sheltered than my people do because I'm around the homebound. I get some of it because I read the news and I'm not completely ignorant, but I don't live necessarily in the same world that they do with HR departments and things like that. Um, so, what sort of things should pastors be thinking about that perhaps they're assuming they're getting that they're not? Does that make sense?
yes, no, it does. I mean, because I think there's things that point each direction here, aren't there?
Uh
There's on
huh.
the one hand, as um, as all other institutions are increasingly delegitimized
Hmm.
or increasingly turned against, like a decent cultural Christianity.
Yeah.
We ask a lot of the church, and no doubt we ask too much of the church. And we expect the church to become a one-stop shop for every social problem or political problem, when the ultimate calling of the church is to administer the sacraments and proclaim the word.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I would always resist the church taking on much more than it can handle.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would be very sensitive to that. And I'm the chairman of also a classical Christian school out here in Idaho, and the same thing ends up happening with the school. Everything
Yeah.
gets foisted on the school. Like, why don't you become a dating agency? And why don't you match make? And why don't you do more on racial justice? And why don't like, oh well, how about we get some reading, writing, and arithmetic done?
Mm-hmm.
And so we demand a lot more of, I'll say, like, relatively healthy institutions, because so many other institutions are unhealthy.
Yeah.
So, and I totally get that problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm leery of piling anything more onto churches and schools in this case, aside from like a call, and here's the other hand, I think, for
Sure.
people to actually build other institutions, places to work, for people of faith, places to do business, and that the church and schools, if they're islands, well, that means that they're going to be eroded eventually. They're not going to be able
Yeah.
to do it all without something sustaining it outside. That it just can't be done. So, and I think that say the Lutheran Church has took that pretty seriously for a long time. It built universities. It's now building other universities, the Lutheran Classical College up in Casper, I know. And, so there needs to be like affiliated businesses and other things so that some of the pressure is taken off. So I think that the most helpful thing to do would be, once again, this is part of painting a picture of what a kind of holistic Christian culture might look like. And then like hopefully inspiring others to participate in building it. And because I don't know how much longer Christians are going to be able to operate within the like the corporate culture, the public schools, at some point it becomes impossible for a Christian to continue to go to those schools and to work at those corporations. I'm not saying I know what the point is, but I'm saying
Right.
we're probably closer to it than we were 10 years ago. Maybe we've passed it.
Mm-hmm.
And that might depend on where you live.
Yeah. And it might depend on the individual, kind of like Luther talking about whether a soldier can be saved. Like, you've got to know your conscience. Like, you got to know the limits of what you can deal with, because there's always going to be someone who's willing to endure more than others, and you just have to be well acquainted with your own conscience on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll put a sharp point on what we just talked about. Like, one of the signs of the crisis in our culture is how much we demand of the church. Like, because that shows that all the other institutions are like untrustworthy. And that needs to be like, I think that needs to be recognized. And like it, and to some extent resisted. That is, the church shouldn't take on extra duties, and to some extent assisted. That is, it should be we should be assisting people to see the problem and to build themselves.
Yeah. Right. I mean, this is one of the beautiful things that came out of the Reformation. The reawakening to the doctrine of vocation. And we had kind of a reawakening of this in the last 20 years, even within the Missouri Synod, and probably beyond the Missouri Synod, and some Reformed circles, although we view things in slightly different ways. But it seems like if the church can really can really teach the vision for what a man is and what he's called by God to do, and what a woman is and what she's called by God to do, and what a family is and what they're called by God to do, and what a society is, then maybe we are beginning to make gains, so that in each of these vocations, these men and women and families and citizens can begin building,
Hmm.
and not tearing down, or at least, repairing the ruins.
Yeah, no, desperate times call for additional measures, and
Mm.
so and they call people to duty, and I think that is to some extent happening. Uh, and it's hard to live in the midst of that stuff. I mean, in some ways, it's easier for me. It certainly, I thought it was easier 2 years ago than it is now,
Hmm.
as a tenured professor at a state university, to kind of speak my mind. I now realize that, well, tenure is not what it used to be, and academic
Hmm.
freedom isn't what it used to be. And but I think I'm still in a position where I should be kind of on the front lines of this. It's much more difficult when you are an employee with 6 kids to feed or 5 kids to feed, of some woke corporation, and
Yeah.
it's a much more difficult situation. There are things like right now all over the country that are kind of helping out people from that situation,
Yeah.
and my hope is that more and more people will pursue them.
Hmm.
And we do some stuff here in Idaho to expose more and more men to that particular reality. That is, that there are alternatives, and I trust that, and this is outside the church that I do this, but and I trust that more and more people will learn about such alternatives.
Yeah. Um, so are there any other kind of pieces of advice that you would um, give all members of the church in terms of, or at least encouragement, maybe not just advice, just encouragement, with regard to being fully aware of what we're up against, and not to be dismayed by the world's response, like that we should learn to expect what's coming.
Well, I mean, I won't call this advice, but I will say that there's a very clarifying article in First Things about this topic, by Aaron Renn, Renn, that's called "The Three Worlds of, I don't know, Evangelicalism or American
Mm-hmm.
Evangelicalism." It was the number one article on First Things website last year, and it was in the print edition. And what Aaron argues is that, like, for people of my age, 50 and over, um, there's been a revolution in the world. That is, Christianity used to be considered a positive. That is, say, if you were
Mm-hmm.
running for office, you had to show you were kind of a good church going guy.
Mm-hmm.
And we could at least pretend that America had a Christian majority. We had institutions like the Moral Majority, Jerry Falwell's organization, when I was a kid. And that world ended. Like the world where Christianity was considered a positive, what Aaron calls the positive world, is over. And he says then we entered this different world. He calls it the neutral world, from something like 1993 to the Obergefell decision, say
Mm-hmm.
2013, 14, 15. And they're like, it didn't matter one way or the other whether you're Christian. It didn't hurt, didn't help. But his big finding, or big part of the argument, is that we now live in a negative world where it's considered a negative. And that just
Mm-hmm.
requires a whole new way of approaching life. I
Yeah.
mean, you can't count on a whole lot of things when you're people my age, that you thought you could count on. And
Mm-hmm.
kind of learning about that. And Aaron is going to have a book that the article is turning into a book, as that happens sometimes. Um, kind of explicating this, but it means a whole new, different approach. The things that used to work aren't going to work,
Yeah.
and then trying to think through what it means to be a minority with no moral claim on the majority.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Christian situation, and it requires much different strategies for churches. I think one of the things I try to get at in the article is that one of the things is that, that being an uncompromising adherent to Christian sexual ethics is going to increase in costs. It's going to cost you more than it used to. And that you need to be willing to pay it. And when it comes to your kids, when it comes to raising the next generation of Christians, that you're going to have to, they're only going to know the negative world. And so you being a shepherd for that flock, your duty is to instill in them and, kind of represent for them how to deal with that new world. It's not like we don't have great strategies yet for it, but it's something that needs to be thought through on a pretty deep level if we're going to, survive. So I think it is going to mean like very early identification of, the degenerate teachings that exist in our culture. I have my emails open here, and I have this email, from the rainbow spectrum. Like, your kids are going to like get bombarded with that all the time. So you have to there has to be early and often like meeting that teaching. Yeah. It's just not something that Christians in America have ever had to deal with. So our situation is going to be unique, pretty interesting, and require a different kind of vigilance than it used to.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, Scott. Please give my best to your pastor, Pastor Paul's out there.
I will.
And you'll be in our prayers. Thanks for fighting the good fight and, helping to lead the way on this.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on, Pastor.